What is going on, everybody? The next dozen traps are going to be out of the Scandinavian opening, which, if you don't know what that is e4, and then black plays at d5, causing immediate conflict. You're more or less supposed to take. If you don't, it's a mistake. So, white captures the d-pawn, and black comes through and captures the d-pawn with their queen. Most people kick it out directly with advancing their queenside knight, but if you move your kingside knight, that is also a standard book move. Bishop comes and pins the knight. Bishop comes and unpins it. Black will develop their queenside knight, and that's when you go ahead and push up your queen pawn up 2 to d4. And here's the trap. If black captures the knight on f3, you go ahead and recapture with your bishop on f3. And they're thinking this. Their knight and queen are both attacking the pawn. That is 2 attackers. How many defenders does white have? 1. So black should be able to come through and take that pawn. They take it with the queen. If you took it with your queen, they would recapture with their knight, and then they would be threatening forking your king and your rook on the end. But white has this amazing move. Bishop capture knight on c6. It removes the defender from the queen, so now the queen is hanging, and that comes with check. So now black must take care of the check first before anything. No matter what they do, they lose the queen. If they capture with the pawn, they lose the queen. If they move the king, they lose the queen. Their only other option is to block with the queen. That's the worst of them all, and that would result in checkmate. Beautiful trap. Not so much a trap, but we're going to count it anyways. It's more or less a mistake from black. If white does the standard move and captures the d-pawn, and the queen comes out and recaptures, the standard move is kicking the queen with the knight advancing to c3. 2 of the most common moves are queen back to d8, or queen to a5. But if they make the mistake of putting the queen on c6, you can bring the bishop to b5, pinning the queen against the king, and the queen will fall. Easy does it. The next trap in our lineup is right from the main line. When e takes d, queen comes out and captures d5. The knight comes to c3, kicking the queen. We discussed 2 of the main moves from here. The most common is queen back to d8. The main line continues. d4, knight c6, knight f3, and then the bishop comes out and pins the knight on g4. That is a mistake, though, because you can punish them with a trap. Pawn d5, kicking the knight. Nothing really seems too logical at this point in time, unless if you want to put it back to the starting square on b8, other than the move. Knight e5, doubling the attack on your knight that's pinned. But you can go ahead and capture the knight for free, because they really can't capture the queen. They're going to try, and if they do, you bring your bishop to b5, checking the king. They got 2 options. They can block with the queen, which you will capture it. Once they move their king, you get the bishop at the bottom, and you are up 2 minor pieces. Or they can push the c-pawn. If they push the c-pawn, you can capture the c-pawn with your d-pawn, and now you are threatening to push the c-pawn or capture the b pawn both come with a discovered attack on the king with your bishop. So black only has two major tries from here. If they make the mistake and they try capturing your pawn, you go ahead and capture the pawn, checking them, and now they only have one move to block, and that is with their queen. And you take the queen with check with your bishop. They must sidestep. Once they sidestep, I would recommend capturing the bishop. Other than capturing the bishop, you can also come in with a check with your knight, and once they get out of check, let's say they capture your bishop, you don't have to take the rook right away. You can capture the bishop and put that rook capture on h8 on the back burner until the next turn. That's if they capture with the pawn. Their best move, honestly, is pushing the a pawn. If they push the a pawn, you go ahead and push your c pawn with check. And from here, they have to either capture your bishop with their a pawn, and in that case, you would capture their queen with your pawn and promote that to a queen with check. Once they capture it with their rook, trying to defend their bishop on the bottom, you can recapture their bishop with your knight now. If they don't play that move, we're talking a6 attacking your bishop. They do have this good move as well. Good is obviously not in the traditional sense. They can bring their bishop to e2, attacking your bishop that's on b5. And if that's the case, you do not want to capture with your knight, because if you did, that would be a mistake, and they can unwind the trap. They can bring their queen to a5, attacking your king with check, and your bishop is hanging. So the only way to solve that problem is bringing your knight back to c3, so you solve the check and you're guarding your bishop. But then black would be able to castle queenside, and they're out of danger mostly. So you would capture this bishop move right here with your king. Now they no longer have that check. And same thing. Now if they tried taking your pawn, same exact explanation we just had. And if they try pushing the pawn to a6 now, you do not push the a pawn like we just did to c7. This time we captured the b pawn with your c pawn. And when they capture your bishop now with their a pawn, that you only have one move which saves it. Any other move but this will put you at a disadvantage overall. You must bring the knight to c6, attacking the queen. You're threatening to take the rook with your pawn now, and there's no move where the queen can go, which will guard and be able to kill the pawn that's promoted. So their best effort from here is actually just bringing the queen to c8, allowing the queen to fall with a promotion, and then the rook can capture from there. If you do go this route, bring the knight to a7, attacking the rook and scooping up the loose b pawn once the rook moves, because it's guarded by the rook on c3. It's a beautiful trap, very sneaky, very tricky. Does not seem like they're doing anything wrong when they come in with the knight to e5, but it is a major, major mistake. And that's the way the cookie crumbles here. The next trap in our lineup is after e takes d, and queen comes out and recaptures, and the knight yet again comes to c3, kicking the queen. Instead of retreating all the way back to the starting square, this trap is going to come out of the a5 line. And standard development, knight f3, bishop comes and pins the knight. You question that pin by pushing h3, and if the bishop captures the knight, you obviously recapture with the queen, and now you're hitting this weak b7 pawn. Standard development, knight c6 fixes that, and you come in and you pin that knight to the king. Now, if they ignored it, bishop capture with check, recapture, queen come in check, they would drop the rook. So they have to add a defender to that knight. The only other move that doesn't fall in the trap line is castle queenside. But if they castle queenside, it's really ugly pawn structure, and their king really isn't protected, and you have a 2-pawn advantage. So logically, the only piece that can come to the knight's aid to recapture is the queen on b6. If the queen comes to b6, you can jump the knight to d5, attacking the queen. The queen cannot take the hanging bishop because of a royal fork on c7. So there's 3 spaces the queen can move to that doesn't die right away. It has a5, which you push b4, and now the queen is trapped, so they can take the bishop on the exit before the royal fork. The other 2 squares, they have d4 and c5. d4 first we'll discuss. If they go d4, just go ahead and fork the king and rook. If they go c5, which is the logical move, it's the only square out of all the options which still retains protecting that knight. In this case, you go ahead and jump the knight and fork the king and rook anyways. Now this is very important here. King has 2 options, d7 and d8. Regardless of which space they use, it's important to push this d4 pawn, because if we don't, when we take the rook, we lose the bishop. But by pushing this d pawn, it pulls the queen away from being able to attack that bishop. Standard line is when it captures it, the best move, if the king goes to d8, you actually have this awesomer move, knight to e6 check. And when they capture you, you take the bishop and the rook in the corner, rather than just forking the rook. They have options. If they don't take the pawn, if they want to still be a little twat and stick to that bishop like glue, they can go to b6. And if they go to b6, you have the queen take f7 line. And regardless if they take, they can't take the bishop yet. So if they try taking the knight, if they take it with the king, you have bishop f4 attacking the king. And now their options are really limited. If they go to the back row, then the queen's going to take the bishop and then the rook. And their only other move would be king d7. And if that's the case, go ahead and take the knight, and just the card house will come tumbling down. So if the king comes to d7, you still push d4, and if the queen takes the pawn, then you go ahead and take the rook. And once again, if the king's a little, or if the queen's a little twat and moves to, let's say, b6, I'm pretty sure it's, yeah, bishop f4 covering that knight. And then you can push the, regardless of what they do, since the knight is pinned, then you can push your d pawn and go from there. Very tricky trap to memorize because there's a lot of ins and outs. I would just recommend taking your time and doing the calculations. On to the next. These next traps do not happen in the exchange lines. White instead will develop their knight right away to f3, more or less offering up the free pawn on e4. If that's the case, jump your knight to g5. Now from this position, there are a couple traps we're going to cover. Just for example, if they bring the queen to d5, attacking the knight and covering their pawn, you can push d3. And when the pawn captures, you recapture with your bishop on d3, and you're more or less asking them now to take a second free pawn on g2, attacking your loose rook, disabling the possibility of castling kingside as well. If that happens, move your bishop to e4, attacking the queen. It attacks the queen, it's covering the rook in the corner, and it's protected by the knight on g5. The black queen has absolutely no safe moves to go. It's trapped. But it can go to g4, and it's protected by the bishop, and it's only being attacked by the white queen. So the white queen will go ahead and exchange and capture the black bishop on g4 and be recaptured by the black bishop on g4. But that's a forceful combo which draws that black bishop away from protecting that b7 pawn. Now you're attacking the rook in the corner. Black's best attempt from here is pushing h6, and it's pretty much tied for what the best move is. I would recommend moving your rook to g1, because this way you're not just giving up one of your pieces. If they capture your knight, you get the bishop, and if they move the bishop to try to save it or something, you can then move your knight and save it. If you don't like that idea, what you can do instead is just as equally good. You can sack the knight on f7, threatening to take the rook and more or less forcing the king to come out and lose his castling rights. And once all that shenanigans goes on, you can go ahead and capture that rook in the corner. Nice one, eh? This next trap, just like the previous one, you do not capture the d-pawn. You go ahead and bring your knight to f3 right away. And if black captures the e-pawn, attacking your knight on f3, you go ahead and advance your knight to the 5th rank to g5 again. And if the black party decides to protect their pawn with a knight this time, you can go ahead and move your d-pawn to d3, attacking it and offering it up at the same time. Black will capture, and you will recapture with your bishop on d3. A big, huge mistake by black would be to attempt to kick your knight with h6, a very common move, because you will jump in with your knight, forking the queen and rook. If black doesn't want to lose one of them, or think he doesn't want to lose one of them, he will capture that knight with his king. And if that's the case, you can bring your bishop right to g6, attacking the king with check, and taking the escape square that protects the queen, e8, away from them. So they can either sidestep or kill the bishop, but regardless of what they choose, the queen will fall. Ain't that a lovely? You give up 2 minor pieces for the queen. These next traps revolve around the line where after e takes d, f5, the queen does not come and capture the pawn right away, but equally as good, and the main line is knight to f6. Because no matter what white does, let's say, we'll play a weird one. If white plans on protecting the pawn, black can capture it, and then there's just an exchange of minor pieces. So the trap lines we're discussing today are knight to f6, and then knight to c3, defending their d pawn, the second one that originated from e. Knight will capture the loose pawn on d5, and rather than capturing the knight and getting rid of their only developed piece and kind of going backwards in development, white plays the move bishop c4. The knight will backtrack to b6, attacking the bishop with the same maneuver, and the bishop will tuck away at b3. Black will continue standard development with knight to c6. White will follow suit with standard development with knight f6. And if the black bishop comes in and tries pinning the knight, it's a very common tactic. Bishop will sacrifice on f7, checking the king. And after the black king recaptures the bishop on f7, the kingside knight will jump to g5 with check. And no matter what the king chooses to do, most logical is probably backing back up to either e8 or g8. The queen can then come and capture the minor piece that they were down with queen capture on g4. So not only do you get your material back, you're actually a pawn up, and you took black's castling rights away from them. That's a nice one. And this next trap, it is following suit of the last. After e takes d, the queen doesn't capture right away. Black will take the knight f6 line, and white will defend it with knight c3. The knight will come and take that pawn back on knight capture d5. And just to explain why, white doesn't want to capture this knight because the black queen would recapture. White no longer has a piece to kick out the queen right away, other than, I guess, the goofy move c4. But you also gave away your only developed piece, and now black has a centralized queen. So instead of recapturing, you want to double up the threat with bishop c4. The knight will fall back to b6, and then you tuck your bishop away to b3 and get it out of harm's way to safety. Black will develop their knight to c6. And now logical move is white develop their other knight to f3. Standard development is pushing the e pawn to e5, opening up the line for the dark squared bishop. And white will do the same by pushing d3, opening up the line for their dark squared bishop. So the light squared bishop will come in and pin the knight to the queen with bishop g4. And here go the sparks. It's a risk you're taking. I will remind you with this trap, it's one of the only traps, if not the only trap, that I will mention that if they don't fall for it, you're actually in a lot of trouble. But if you're playing someone which is not going to give up a free queen, by all means, go for it. If black plays properly, they'll just capture your knight and you're not looking good. But if black captures the queen, they are in trouble because then you have bishop to f7 check. Their only move being king e7. Then you bring your other bishop into the action with bishop g5, checking the king again. King only has one move. King d6. You bring your other knight into the action. So you got all minor pieces coming in to knight e4, giving up the knight. It's the only legal move black has, capturing the knight on e5. You go ahead and push f4, attacking the king again. King has two moves from here. It's got king d5 and king f5. If it goes f5, it's game over with knight g3 check. King's only got one move, backing up to g4. And then you got two ways to finish it. You got bishop h5 checkmate, or bishop e6 checkmate. So if black does the logical thing and it goes the other way, I misspoke. It's d4, not d5. So if it goes the other way, the only legal move which continues and doesn't lose right away, black's bishop on d1 will fall with rook capture d1. And from here, if you notice, the black queen is under threat. There is no way to directly checkmate the black king, but I will mention this. There is only one move which doesn't lose for black here. And if you look here, we'll pause and let the computer catch up. All right, a couple minutes later, it caught up. If you look, every single move leads to checkmate except for giving up the black queen. So if the black queen gives themselves up, you go ahead and, before you capture the queen, you must throw in the move c3, moving the king even closer to e3. It's the only legal move. Then you can capture the queen. And from here, there's only two moves which don't end in checkmate. And they both are giving up another piece. First move is rook to e8, giving up the rook to the bishop. And the other move is knight d4, but you don't capture it. You go ahead and castle. And you're threatening to, sandwich the black king with checkmate. But if you look from here, you have the opportunity to even material right away by capturing the knight. Or if you want to go down the line, I'm not going to explain them all. The only legal move which doesn't end in disaster for black here, as we said, is giving up the rook. And after the bishop noms the rook, you're actually up in material. You're up in exchange and 2 pawns up. And those are the lines if you want to go ham. Go ahead and it would be a 20-minute video just for this one trap alone if I went through them all. But that is that. It's a nice trap, and it ends in defeat either way for black. Hope you enjoyed that one. In this next trap, it's the main line where e takes d. Queen comes out and captures right away on d5. And the white knight kicks the queen on c3. The reason why a lot of grandmasters put their queen right back to d8 and don't really worry about tempo with the Scandinavian is because when you go to a5, there's a big risk of tricks, traps, and losing tempo, and this is a prime example of it. Standard development, d4, knight comes to f6, bishop to c4, all traditional standard moves for the Scandi, and a very common move when things get cramped and squares get taken from the queen is pushing c6, giving the queen an escape route back to home base, the a5 to d8 diagonal. So once that gets pushed, the queen moves to e2, backing up the light squared bishop, and it's on the same file as the king. Strong move. Black's light squared bishop will move to f5, and that's when the dark squared bishop for white gets put on d2, looking for some discovery attacks by moving the knight and some tricks. If black makes the mistake of developing the other knight to d7 before protecting the king, you can go ham and do the blah blah blah. Move the knight to b5, and you hit the black queen with your dark squared bishop. And there's only there's, what is that, 4 squares which the black queen can go to without getting killed instantly by a miner. And just to prove it to you, the strongest move for black is actually killing the knight. Right there. Queen, take b5. So let's cover all the squares instantly that the queen gets trapped. If the queen goes to a4, b3 gets pushed, it's trapped. I mean, it can go, if it went to the only square which isn't directly attacked, to a6, then you have the fork between the king and queen, and you lose it that way. If the queen goes to right away to a6, like we said, gets forked and lost. If it goes back to home base, unfortunately, that's game over, because the knight can just go to d6 and smother, because the pawn on e7 can't capture. It's pinned by the white queen. And the only safe square, quote-unquote safe, is b6. And in that case, where you can do this regardless, knight comes to d6, attacking the king. And once the king is moved, because it's forced to, go to d8, there's 2 equally strong moves. You can take the bishop just for free, call it a day, or you can take the pawn on f7 and fork the 2, the king and the rook in the corner. And that's a good lesson for you guys on why not to move the queen out early before you have finished development. On to the next. And we finally have one for the black team. When e captures d, you want to go ahead and capture with your queen. And when they bring their knight to c3, you want to bring your queen to a5. The reason why I think a5 is slightly better than d8 is because if you bring it to d8, you're reversing a developing move. So you know that you're good to go when they continue their development to d4. You go ahead and develop your knight to f6. If they bring their queen out, that's when you know you can try to go for this trap, because you know what's coming. They are currently putting pressure on your b7 pawn, so you can't bring out your light squared bishop yet. To protect that pawn, you can push c6, and that also allows you an escape route for your queen if the heat gets turned up too high. You can bring it back to d8. From here, you will see the bishop get put on d2, looking to set up a trap for your queen by moving the knight on c3. But we got a little pressure of our own to deal with first. We bring our bishop to g4, hitting that queen. No squares really are logical except for putting it on g3, so they're more likely to do that. Once they do that, you want to close up your pawn structure and open up your diagonal for your dark squared bishop, pushing e6. And here we go. If they try getting slick with you, bringing the knight to b5, attacking your queen with a discovered attack, and looking to jump their knight to c7, forking your king and rook, you can laugh at them and go ahead and scoop up that bishop, kamikaze that bitch. She's just a hoe. You don't need her. Queen capture d2. Check. The king must recapture d2. That's when we bring in the chivalrous knight to e4, attacking their king and their hoe as well. Once they evade the attack, you go ahead and capture the slut herself with knight capture g3. And from here, two options. If they want to save their rook, they can capture their knight, or your knight, with either h capture g3 or f capture g3. And if they do that, then you can capture their knight with c take b5. And the other option is if when you capture the queen, they say fuck it, and they jump in with their knight to c7, forking the two. You want to bring your king over to d8, or d7 works as well. When they capture your rook, that's okay, because you capture their rook. And they won't be able to escape with their knight, and it's going to take a bunch of turns for them to, I guess, move the puzzle pieces around to get to your knight. So that is finally a trap for Team Black, and on to the next. Here's one more trap for Team Black. If E captures D, we're going to play the slow way with knight f6. And if they push their d pawn to d4, take your knight and capture the pawn sitting on d5. If they push c4, do this weird move, bringing your knight to b4, which allows them to bring their queen to a4, hitting the 2. Not only is it checking you, it's attacking the knight that's resting on b4. You want to block the check with the knight, and it protects your other knight. If you were to just move your knight back, then you'd lose the knight straight out. By bringing the knight on b to c6, it allows them to basically do a couple things. They're gonna kick your knight that's on b4 by pushing a3. And that's when you want to go ahead and bring it back to a6. So they're going to push their d pawn again to d5. You can bring your knight to c5, hitting that queen. And if they want to maintain that pin and prevent you from being able to escape with the knight, they're going to play queen to b5. And that's when you can push your e-pawn to e5. Don't worry about them fianchettoing, or not fianchettoing. It's been a long day. En passant, capture your pawn. If that's the case, you would just go ahead and push a 6, and the queen is trapped. So their best bet from here is actually, I mean, they really don't have a best bet, but once you bring up that it protects your knight and you're threatening to jump up with your knight, checking them with a discovery. So you want to go ahead and let them capture your knight when it's their turn, and you ignore that. And that's when you push up your B pawn to B6. Now, you're basically threatening to push A6 next. Like if they did something stupid, you'd push A6 and their queen would be trapped. So their only attempt to escape is to bring the queen to B4 and then get out the long way. But if they do that, you have the move knight to D3, checking the king. And then once they capture the knight or move, you get to pick up the queen and you live happily ever after. There's also one odd looking move. After they capture the knight and you press the B6, they can try moving the king so you don't have that check with the knight. But if that's the case, push A5, and now you're threatening bishop A6. So if they did something stupid, you'd have bishop A6, and you'd win it outright that way. And there's no way to stop that. It's inevitable. So let's say they bring their bishop out attacking your knight. Don't matter. Bring in your bishop to A6, and you lived happily ever after. Team Black. And to wrap this up, we have one more trap for Black. If E captures D, I'm going to go ahead and bring your knight to F6 again. And if White tries protecting their D pawn with pushing C4, push E6. And when D captures E, you want to recapture it with your bishop to E6. Logical move is pushing D4. And if this is the case, bring your bishop to B4, checking the king. They're going to block with their bishop rather than the knight. Otherwise, they're going to have a hard time developing their bishop because it would be blocked in then. And it would be pinned. So from here, you want to back up your bishop rather than capturing with queen to E7. And this kind of tricks White into attacking your queen and doubling the attack on your bishop, thinking you'd win the bishop. Because after you resolve something like check, you would win the bishop either way. But you have this beautiful resource, bishop D7, which comes with check. So no matter what White does to stop the check, their queen falls. And that wraps up the Dirty Dozen. Hope you enjoyed.